G'day everyone, my name's Gabriel, Director for Residential Prestige in New South Wales.
And I'm George, New South Wales, ACT and Victorian State Director, and welcome to the Opt-in Prestige series.
In this series, we're going to talk about the current state of the prestige market. We're going to explore some of the nuances between compromise assets and best-in-class properties. We're also going to analyse key drivers of demand for waterfront homes, and we're going to touch on the implications of the federal budget as it pertains to prestige property.
And we're also lucky enough to have our special guest, Darren Curtis from Forbes Global Properties, as well as Richard Young from Midkey, to give us a client perspective over the prestige market over the last 12 months.
George, there's been a lot of talk about the federal budget to the point where there's almost a saturation of market commentary out there on socials and out there in the media. But a lot of the talk has been around the impacts to the broader market. What I'm curious to know is what sort of implications are the policy settings going to have on the prestige market?
Yeah, Gab, look, there's been a lot of speculation in relation to the policy changes and how it affects the broader market. And we're starting to see a bit of a slowdown at the moment. In terms of the prestige end, it's normally driven by a lot of high net worth individuals who are owner occupiers rather than investors. So generally, they're a bit, not as impacted by the wider market.
Absolutely agree, George. And look, despite the softer conditions in the broader market, the prestige market continues to be underpinned by a lack of supply, a continuation of offshore interests, and also high net worth individuals prioritising scarcity, long-term value and wealth preservation.
So Gabby, zooming out, looking at the bigger picture, how's Sydney's prestige property market in its current condition tracking in comparison to capital cities such as Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth?
Absolutely, George. Look, much like the broader market, the prestige market in Sydney is in a current state of decline, with this being evident through extended selling periods and a greater collaboration between vendors and buyers as pricing expectations align to meet current market conditions.
Okay, and in your opinion, how's it impacting the prestige property market?
Well, George, this is due to a multitude of different factors, including a softer economy, persistently high inflation, a continuation of geopolitical uncertainty overseas, and I guess to a slightly lesser degree, elevated interest rates and the policy settings announced in the federal budget. Collectively, these factors are impacting the performance of the stock market, business confidence and consumer sentiment, each being key drivers of demand within the prestige sector.
Gabby, you mentioned high net worth individuals. So how are they impacting the market of late?
In Sydney, there's been a bit of a divergence in market activity outside of your traditional prestige markets like eastern suburbs and the lower North Shore. To give you a bit of an example, a property in Sydney's inner west in Drummoyne, waterfront property, executive residence, sold for a record $29 million. That being a record price not only for the suburb but for the whole region. At the same time, in Sydney South, a waterfront property in Connells Point sold for $16.68 million, whilst a beachfront property in Gunnamatta Bay in Cronulla sold for a record $22.5 million. In Sydney's upper north, in Avalon Beach, there was a waterfront property there that also sold for $28 million, but that property sold after undergoing a significant price correction from its lofty $50 million asking price. Now, while each of those properties represent record prices for those locations, by far and away, the highest profile sales were that of a waterfront reserve property in Rose Bay that transacted for $83.5 million, and also for a whole floor Crown residence in Barangaroo selling for $51.5 million. Now, interestingly, both those properties were acquired by the Herod Birkenstock, who must be doing pretty well selling all those fancy German sandals.
Yeah, there's some pretty big numbers.
Absolutely.
So Gabby, Melbourne's broader market has been quite flat over the last 12 to 24 months.
Mm-hmm.
Have we seen the same impact for prestige property market?
But Melbourne's prestige market continues to remain very cautious and highly selective, though softer demand is being offset by very limited supply. The exclusive residential locality of Toorak, for example, has undergone some of the largest declines, while well-positioned lifestyle locations such as Middle Park have held up comparatively well. Now, I want to throw in a bit of an interesting fun fact here, but Victoria, back in January 25, laid claim to the national house price record through the sale of Kunak, a grand Victorian estate situated in Toorak, which reportedly sold for $136.1 million. Now, it's come to pass that that was actually a consolidated transaction with an adjoining apartment block that sold for 12.1, which brings into question Victoria's claim to the national house price record, which technically is still held by New South Wales for two properties in Point Piper, which sold for $130 million. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that in as a fun fact and a friendly deed to our Melbourne counterparts.
Yeah. Wow. I think $136 million, bundled or not, still buys you a lot of real estate. But it shows you that there's serious buyers out there that have a lot of money to spend.
Absolutely. And look, you know, in Kunak's defence, it is one of the world-class properties and one of the most significant estates, not just in Melbourne, but in the country.
So, Gabby, I know I'm excited about the next Olympics, 2032, going to be hosted in Brisbane. In your point of view, have you seen any impact to the prestige property market because of it?
Absolutely, George. Look, Brisbane has been one of the strongest performing markets in the country in the last couple of years, recently surpassing Melbourne's median house price. And this has really been a direct result of the significant infrastructure projects associated with those up-and-coming Olympics. And when you think about the continuation of interstate migration and its relative value compared with other capitals, it's widely expected that Brisbane's prestige market is going to continue, at least in the short to medium term.
Okay. And Gold Coast obviously is a neighbouring region to Brisbane. Has it been impacted in the same way?
I think the Gold Coast has shared a similar narrative to Brisbane, undergoing significant growth over those last couple of years, much due to especially since COVID. While buyer activity has recently softened a little, buyer demand remains especially strong for luxury apartments in areas like Main Beach and Burleigh Heads, but also for beachfront properties in Mermaid Beach and for riverfront properties in areas like Broadbeach Waters. To give you a bit of an example, a luxury penthouse has just sold off the plan for an eye-watering $30 million. And this property was purchased by a local. If you have a look at the renders of this property, which is, I think it's due for completion in early 2027, it's set over 2 levels, it's 700 square metres of internal living space, it has its own private pool, and it's got world-class views over the Gold Coast. You can see why the property sold for what it did. It's something pretty special.
Yeah, wow. $30 million, that's just over $40,000 per square metre.
It is.
That'll probably reserve you a spot in Sydney Harbour, I reckon.
If you're lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Gabby, let's head west. Can you tell our viewers about the prestige property market in Perth?
Absolutely, George. Look, the prestige property market in Perth has finally entered into a bit of a softer phase, but not after undergoing several years of exceptional capital growth. WA's strong economy, distinct lack of supply, and a continuation of buyer interest both domestically and abroad is resulting in strong demand for properties in areas like Dalkeith, Peppermint Grove, Mossman Park, and the beachside suburb of Cottesloe. A $57.5 million acquisition for a riverfront property in Mossman Park back in 2009, which set the national house price record for the time, has just been listed back on the market, and it's widely tipped to reset the record for a property in WA, so watch that space.
So, Gabby, we've talked about our capital cities. We've talked about some pretty big numbers. What's your key takeaway for our viewers?
Look, I think it's fair to say that on a national level, the prestige property market has come off the boil compared to recent market activity over the past few years. And what we're seeing is buyers becoming a little bit more selective and taking longer to commit. This is resulting in a bit more of a polarised market where best-in-class properties continue to outperform, while secondary offerings are taking longer to attract a buyer.
Agree. Thanks, Gabby. Very insightful there. That concludes episode 1. In our next episode, we'll be digging into the differences between compromised assets and best-in-class properties, as well as what's driving the value for waterfront market. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.